espero que les gusta este seminario. Y a continuación interviene José Tudela Aranda, Secretario General de la Fundación Manuel Giménez, Luise Rürup, Delegada en España de la Fundación Friedrich-Ebert, y David Moya, el nuevo director del Observatorio de Derecho Público del Instituto de Derecho Público Barcelona. Pepe, por favor, cuando quieras.
Hay que activar el audio.
Perfecto. Ahora se me escucha, ¿verdad?
Perfecto.
Bien. Bueno, en primer lugar, mis primeras palabras tienen que ser de agradecimiento, y agradecimiento especialmente para Mario por todo su trabajo y porque de alguna manera es el alma que nos ha permitido llegar hasta aquí. En segundo lugar, tengo que destacar que es el 11º Observatorio sobre el Federalismo que organiza conjuntamente la Fundación con el Instituto de Derecho Público, en este caso con la valiosa colaboración del Foro Federation. Me sirve también para recordar y en buena medida homenajear a Eliseo, que hoy no es director del instituto por primera vez desde que lo iniciamos, pero esta iniciativa le debe mucho, si no todo. Se inició en una comida en el Mesón del Toro. Hoy no podemos comer juntos, desgraciadamente, en el Mesón del Toro, pero quiero recordar esa comida y, por supuesto, la inspiración que durante todos estos años ha sido Eliseo para que este proyecto pueda salir adelante. Dar las gracias a David, por supuesto, por la colaboración de esto y por haber facilitado que lleguemos a buen puerto esta tarde. Finalmente, mi agradecimiento tiene que ser trasladado a todos los ponentes y a aquellos que nos escuchan desde sus casas o incluso que nos van a escuchar en días sucesivos. La experiencia nos demuestra que perdemos el contacto físico, que perdemos una experiencia insustituible, pero que también encontramos nuevos amigos a través de las redes y que la sesión de hoy se va a prolongar y se va a proyectar en los próximos días. Por lo demás, ¿qué decir del tema? Lo debatimos hoy y lo seguiremos debatiendo. Seguiremos debatiendo sobre cuál es el mejor modelo para hacer frente a estas crisis, ya sea en un estado centralizado o en un estado descentralizado. Nos queda mucho por aprender, eso está claro. Lo estamos pudiendo ver estos días en España. No llegamos a saber por qué el virus de repente nos azota y por qué de repente el virus decae. Sí, se pueden apuntar algunas cosas, pero realmente en última instancia creo que sigue dominando la incertidumbre. Lo que está claro es que ha habido estados descentralizados, estados federales muy eficientes, ha habido estados centralizados muy eficientes y ha habido estados descentralizados que no lo han sido tanto, al igual que ha habido estados centralizados que no lo han sido tanto. Ello no quita para que cada estado, cada fórmula política tenga que encontrar cómo corregir sus defectos. En mi opinión, en España es evidente que la solución sigue pasando por fórmulas descentralizadas que, por supuesto, hagan hincapié en la importancia de la coordinación, de una coordinación que va más allá de tomar determinadas medidas conjuntas u homogéneas. Es una colaboración que tiene también importancia a nivel de información, a nivel de comunicación, de compartir experiencias. Por ello quiero destacar que aunque a veces se ha dicho, bueno, han fallado los mecanismos de coordinación en España o han sido deficientes o un lastre que tenemos tradicional se ha hecho más evidente en estos casos, creo que ello ha ocultado una comunicación informal entre los distintos actores que ha sido también muy importante y que forma parte de la cultura de un Estado descentralizado. Yo no me voy a extender, saludo a los amigos que nos van a hablar de los casos de Estados Unidos, de México, mi buen amigo Daniel en Barcelona, al que le quiero mandar un saludo especial, y de Alemania, hola Félix también, porque me parece que tenemos una oportunidad excelente de mirar hacia las experiencias comparadas y de esta manera saber un poco mejor qué está sucediendo entre nosotros. Muchas gracias. Acabo mi intervención agradeciendo de nuevo a Mario su trabajo. Mario, das...
Pensaba, pues, Luise Rürup.
Sí,
Okay.
con mucho gusto. Muy buenas tardes y un cordial bienvenido a todas y todos al 11º Observatorio, que ofrece, como siempre, un intercambio abierto de experiencias entre académicos, políticos y el público interesado. Desde su fundación hace casi 100 años, la Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung se ha mantenido fiel a su convicción que la democracia sigue siendo una tarea permanente. No es un sistema que una vez establecida funciona por sí mismo. Debe ser nutrido, alimentado, modernizado todo el tiempo y fortalecido por una fuerte orientación de valores. Por la Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung estos son la libertad, la justicia social y la solidaridad internacional. Toda la experiencia demuestra que el interés por la democracia aumenta cuando las decisiones y las leyes se adoptan cerca del ciudadano, es decir, a nivel local y regional. En este contexto, el principio de la subsidiariedad también ha demostrado su valor desde el punto de vista de la política democrática. Para nosotros en la FES, en la Fundación Friedrich Ebert, esta es una de las razones por las que los sistemas de gobierno con estructuras federales en los que se garantizan los procesos de formación de opinión y de toma de decisiones a nivel local y regional son tan importantes. Por lo tanto, es muy bueno que desde ya muchos años, junto con nuestros socios y contrapartes, en la Fundación Manuel Giménez, el Instituto de Derecho Público y también con el World Forum of Federation, hemos estado reflejando sobre el federalismo, presentando nuevos resultados de la investigación y llevando a cabo un diálogo transnacional. Nos complace mucho la productiva cooperación y queremos agradecer a nuestros socios, especialmente a Mario Kölling, por su colaboración colegiada y la moderación de hoy también. Me alegro especialmente que el presidente del Parlamento Aragón participe en nuestra reunión hoy. También me gustaría agradecer a nuestros ponentes por sus contribuciones a la discusión desde los Estados Unidos, México y Alemania. Para la Fundación Friedrich Ebert, que aborda aspectos del federalismo y democracia durante el año varias veces, el día de hoy, el 23 de noviembre de este año, por coincidencia es un día especial de reflejo sobre el federalismo. Nuestras colegas de la Fundación en Italia y también en Alemania están organizando conferencias sobre el tema en el mismo día. Estas conferencias tratan de cuestiones fundamentales del estado de federalismo, así como de los desafíos actuales, como la lucha contra la pandemia, así como la nuestra aquí. La pandemia actúa de una manera como un vaso ardiente, ¿no? Las debilidades sistémicas se hacen evidentes, los procesos de aprendizaje han tenido lugar y siguen teniendo lugar. La situación actual está poniendo a prueba a las personas y los sistemas de gobernanza a nivel nacional y europeo. Una vez más queda claro lo esencial que es disponer de información fiable, de comunicación transparente y de coordinación potente y de sistemas de rendición de cuentas que funcionen y refuerzan la confianza en los gobiernos a todos los niveles. Aparte de este desafío de la pandemia, es importante destacar que las estructuras federales y su desarrollo ulterior también serán de gran importancia para la realización de igualdad de condiciones de vida y para hacer frente a los grandes desafíos de la transformación socioecológica que enfrentamos en todo el mundo. Como dice el presidente de la Fundación, el ex primer ministro Rupak, en una reciente publicación sobre los 30 años de unidad y federalismo alemán, que fue publicada por la Universidad Magdeburg y la Fundación, Dice, reflejando sobre estructuras de gobernanza y democracia, hay que repensar, pensar adelante, pensar al futuro, siempre con la conciencia de que el ser humano es el centro de atención. Muchas gracias, estoy muy curiosa escuchar a las contribuciones y a la discusión.
Muchas gracias, señora Rürup, por esas palabras tan adecuadas. David, tienes ahora la palabra.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Me sumo a las felicitaciones a Mario, pero también a la Fundación Giménez y al agradecimiento a la Fundación Ebert, porque siendo este ya el 11º, ¿no? Observatorio que celebramos, lo hacemos normalizado estos encuentros frecuentes. Sí. Diría también que este debate que afrontamos hoy por 11ª vez, por 11ª vez, lo hacemos en un contexto muy particular, muy acuciante, que nos requiere respuestas y, como decía la colega anterior, que nos plantea grandes retos que surgen, no es que no estuvieran ya en la articulación de los estados compuestos, sino que quedan todavía más evidenciados por la crisis. En este sentido, la crisis está un poco forzando las costuras del sistema y nos arroja enormes retos. Y creo que en pocas ocasiones en este observatorio hemos tenido una oportunidad de abordar una cuestión tan transversal a todas las problemáticas a las que pretende dar respuesta el federalismo. Desde los retos de coordinación, el funcionamiento de las instituciones de representación de la pluralidad territorial, la articulación de los derechos entre los diversos territorios, la relación entre unidad y diversidad en las tomas de decisiones y en las implicaciones, en la distribución de las funciones en cada una de esas tomas de decisiones, sean la escalada, sean la desescalada. Como en muy pocas ocasiones hemos visto que incluso se cuestiona las competencias mismas, la redistribución de competencias, y la propia Comisión Europea está planteando seriamente abordar cuestiones, asumir competencias en materia de sanidad. Es decir, es una crisis que al mismo tiempo, desde la perspectiva federal, nos obliga a abordar múltiples cuestiones, todas ellas interconectadas, y que por tanto creo que van a generar una muy fértil discusión que sin duda no se va a acabar en esta sesión de hoy, pero que esta sesión de hoy, que seguramente contribuye a muchas otras que se están realizando en paralelo sobre esta misma cuestión, tiene una virtud, diría, que ha caracterizado tradicionalmente al observatorio, que es esa mirada comparativa. Una mirada comparativa diversa, buscando no solo los modelos de referencia clásicos, sino yendo más allá, incluso los más lejanos, para intentar encontrar alternativas, aprendizajes, pero también desde la convicción de que esa mirada comparativa sirve para aprender y reajustar y construir un modelo propio, adaptado a las necesidades y realidades de cada país. Es desde esa mirada que quiero agradecer de nuevo a la Fundación, a Mario, su disponibilidad, su trabajo siempre para impulsar este observatorio, que siempre acaba siendo enormemente rico, y espero pues aprender mucho también de los colegas que nos sucederán, ellos sí hablando sustantivamente sobre las cuestiones y no solo limitándose a una breve enunciación de los múltiples problemas que tenemos que abordar. Muchas gracias y ha quedado a su disposición.
Muchas gracias a ti, David, y ánimo, por supuesto, con este nuevo cargo que tienes. Y solamente decir que justamente esta semana, el día 26, se celebra también el Foro de las Autonomías en el Senado, y por supuesto todos están también invitados a participar. Antes de entrar en la sesión de trabajo, doy otra vez la palabra a José Tudela, que quería añadir también una pincelada a su intervención.
Mario, tengo el vídeo, me has bloqueado el vídeo, me parece. Ahora, bien, no, simplemente es muy breve, pero la voluntad de ser breve precisamente me he pedido llegar a un sitio inexcusable, que es el agradecimiento a la Fundación Friedrich Ebert y el saludo a su nueva responsable, a Luise Rürup. Y perdón por la pronunciación, pero no quería dejar de decirlo. La Fundación Friedrich Ebert ha sido, pues desde el principio del observatorio y durante todos estos años, un apoyo también constante en la Fundación. La Fundación, lo mucho o poco que sea hoy, es gracias a colaboraciones, es gracias a haber contado con la ayuda de instituciones como el propio Instituto de Derecho Público y también la Fundación Friedrich Ebert. Por lo tanto, y menos en esta ocasión, en donde hay una nueva responsable, no quería dejar de dar las gracias por esa colaboración y congratularme por ella. Repito, el querer ser breve lleva a veces a omitir lo más importante. Por mi parte, no era nada más, Mario.
Pues muchas gracias. Entramos ahora en la sesión de trabajo. Mi función sería únicamente moderar a los ponentes para que respeten los 15-20 minutos de sus intervenciones. Y en primer lugar, tenemos ya una exclusiva. Felix Knüppling, vicepresidente del Foro de las Federaciones, nos va a presentar las primeras conclusiones de un ambicioso estudio en que se analizan varios sistemas federales y cómo han reaccionado ante la pandemia de la COVID-19 y cómo también la pandemia ha cambiado los propios sistemas federales. Ya he dicho que es una exclusiva, no se ha publicado aún ningún estudio de caso, tampoco se han publicado las conclusiones. Por ello también, Félix, estamos ya con mucha atención y interés de escuchar estas conclusiones. Tienes la palabra y muchas gracias por compartir estas reflexiones con nosotros.
Thank you very much, Mario, for the flowers. I hope I can meet the targets and that you've just and meet the bar that you've just set for me. I'd like to welcome everybody to the seminar and thank you very much for the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak here, particularly to you, Mario, to Pepe Tudela, long-standing partners, to Ms. Rürup from the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, with who we've also worked in the past, and David Moya from the Observatory of Public Law in Barcelona. My name is Felix Knüppling. I've already been introduced. I work for the Forum of Federations, and I'd like to share a presentation with you. Very quickly, it's not moving along here. Some very basic remarks on the pandemic and federalism. I think as it's been mentioned already in the past, that's an unprecedented situation, not just for federal countries, but for everybody in the world. Obviously, pandemic is not just a health crisis, but also very much an economic, social crisis and a governance crisis. So it touches upon all aspects of governance. Responses had to be in a very comprehensive manner. During the first wave, and that's what I'm be talking today, the first wave response, so that covers the period between February and summer this year. Governments largely focused on the health dimension and then also subsequently on the economic fallout and economic relief. What I'm going to present today, and that's the first disclaimer, speaks really about the early months of the crisis. And also very briefly, if we look at the division of competences in the area of health, what we can see is that in unitary and non-federal countries, health is usually centralized competency in unitary countries, whilst in federal countries, constituent units tend to play a more active role, both in the administration as well as in the delivery of health. Which makes also the observation and the comparison of the reaction and response of federal countries in this context very interesting. What interested us very much in this respect was two basic questions. How did federal countries respond to the pandemic? And here comes the second disclaimer. When I talk about federalism or federal countries, I understand this in rather loose and broad terms. That also includes countries that have devolved or just decentralized competencies. So we're not strictly only talking about federal countries. That would already spark otherwise a big debate within the context of this community, whether we should include Spain or not. So please be aware that our understanding of federalism is very broad. And the second big question that interested us was obviously how also the pandemic potentially impacts on federal governance system. More specifically, we looked at questions of division of responsibilities, whether federal countries were actually effective in addressing the crisis, whether institutions and processes were set up in an adequate fashion, and also whether the pandemic forced federal countries to develop or introduce innovations that could be fruitful for the future. Mary had already mentioned we did a multi-country, not a survey, but a small research project that started in March already. We put out 23 short papers reflecting on the first weeks of the crisis. They were all published and on the forum's website. Currently, those papers are being updated, and we hope to put out the publication early next year. We've also released two podcasts. The first one that looked at the crisis in North America and how the US, Canada, and Mexico reacted. And the second edition looked at specifically at intergovernmental relations in Australia and the US. And as we do today, and I'm again very grateful for the opportunity, I think it's a great opportunity to exchange and reflect. We also participated or organized a series of webinars. Now, looking at the 23 countries that we asked experts to investigate, we can see three broad patterns in terms of how countries reacted, and that reflects the division of competencies or responsibilities. So the first one refers to the concentration of political and administrative initiative in the federal or national government of the federation. The second refers to the strengthening of the roles of both orders of government, constituent units, and the federal or national government, with increased initiative and activity of both orders, marked by a high degree of coordination and collaboration. And the third is a category where we see constituent units or states, in the Spanish context, autonomous communities, cantons, provinces, taking a more active role than the federal government, which in these cases had a rather hands-off attitude towards the pandemic. I'd like to emphasize that obviously all those patterns are to some extent very general and maybe even superficial, and it depends on which aspect of the response you really look at. Whether, for example, it is exclusively in the area of health, or whether it is the economic aspect of the response to the crisis. So obviously the picture gets more blurred when you dig into the details, but there are you can draw out those patterns, and I think from an analytical aspect, it's interesting and also relevant. So looking at the countries we investigated and the categories, in the first category that I draw out, you will find countries like Italy, Kenya, Malaysia, Nigeria, Pakistan, Russia, and South Africa, with strong central government response. In Italy, for example, the management of the state of emergency was clearly in the hands of the national government. The regions were consulted prior to the adoption of national regulations, but they could not really oppose measures taken with the overarching purpose of protecting public health and national security. They could adopt their own regulations, although only to the extent that it was allowed by national legislation, or if they wanted to introduce stricter rules than the national one. And what we observed in Italy was that the response produced a strong centralization of powers from the regions to the center. Similarly in Kenya, although health there is a fully devolved function to the subnational entities, which there are called counties, and who have the constitutional responsibility of all health functions. Nevertheless, the national government stepped in because it has the power to set standards, and they centralized the overall response and even reestablished administrative structures dating back to the current 2010 constitution, essentially establishing parallel national government structures and thus ensuring control of the response in the country. Similar responses you can see in Malaysia and Nigeria, which are already very highly centralized federal systems. And there the pandemic led the federal government to adopt even more top-down approach in managing the public health crisis. This, from our perspective, also counts for South Africa, where the provinces are very much dependent on the central government in terms of financial transfers. And the COVID response further enhanced the already very dominant role of the national government. It declared a national state of disaster in response to the virus, which permitted it to issue regulations applicable throughout the country and in all jurisdictions. Most participants in today's seminar know the situation in Spain much better than we do from afar, but a state of alarm was declared pursuant to Article 116 of the Constitution, thereby centralizing decision-making authority in an area which is primarily the responsibility of the autonomous communities. Now, in the next category, we see countries where the pandemic seems to have provided much impetus for intergovernmental cooperation with both the federal or national level and the constituent units closely collaborating and dialoguing about a comprehensive response to the crisis. We saw this in Argentina, where from the beginning, the president was inviting governors to weekly meetings to evaluate the current situation. Decisions about the extent and duration of measures were taken in direct consultation with them. In Austria, government representatives lauded the good cooperation that was maintained during the first weeks of the outbreak. And despite the fact that the federal government has far-reaching powers, the primary tasks for service delivery are within the authority of the lender. And that led to a very strong collaboration. In Australia, even a new intergovernmental body was set up called National Cabinet, which was comprised of the Commonwealth government and the state governments to tackle the response. Canada in this context is a very interesting case because it usually doesn't have very formalized or institutionalized arrangements for intergovernmental cooperation. However, the current prime minister and his cabinet members stayed in very close contact with the provincial governments. This seemed to be one of the lessons they drew from earlier negotiations regarding NAFTA and CETA, where they realized that they benefited very much from close consultation with the with the provinces. India also a high degree of intergovernmental cooperation. Germany and Switzerland definitely also fall into this category, and we'll hear more about Germany later today, so I'll not go into detail here. Third category is where we saw a strong constituent unit response in countries like Brazil, Mexico, the United States. Governors use their relative autonomy basically as a defense mechanism against a federal government that particularly in the beginning was rather reluctant to take decisive measures to contain the spread of the disease. Thus, in some cases, governors acted unilaterally, many times also competing with each other. For example, in relation to the purchase of ventilators or other medical equipment, and sometimes also ignoring or even contradicting the federal government. So here there was maybe less coherence in terms of a national response than in other federal countries. And also we saw, and that is mostly because of historical reasons in some federal countries, where there is very weak nationwide or federal institutions and where are strong centrifugal tendencies, like in Belgium or Bosnia and Herzegovina, or also the European Union, also very strong reaction, stronger compared to the national government. And that also applied to Ethiopia for a very specific reason. The country is currently going through unprecedented political transformation that also impacts heavily on its federal system. So also there was a rather weak national response, and some of the federated entities became very active in the response to the pandemic. And now some preliminary sort of reflections on the outcome of the first wave. So what I've just described is probably not so exciting because it's probably also predictable that, for example, in centralized federations, especially those with the established central government emergency powers, the federal government has tended to decisively lead the way in pandemic response, and likewise in countries like Germany or Switzerland that have very strong and formalized systems of intergovernmental collaboration. There was indeed also a high degree of coordination of policies and approaches between the orders of government. And where national institutions are weak, such as in Belgium or Bosnia, there was accordingly stronger reactions from the subnational units. So it seems that as in other dimension that we can observe, the pandemic's impact on federalism is like an accelerator. It strengthens developments that we've seen before, and it tends to increase efficiency and coordination when this is already given, but it rather adds to confusion and incoherence when this is the prevailing modus operandi in those countries. What we also saw is that the responses in federal countries have been probably more complex than in unitary countries. That also is not so surprising, because federal countries by their nature are complex, because usually decisions involve at least two orders of government. However, despite their complexity, most, not all, federations managed to respond in a coherent fashion in the early days of the crisis, because there was either strong national leadership or the countries have emergency powers that they draw on. Then, yeah.
Just 1 minute, 1.5 minutes.
Sure.
Okay.
Then coming to the very last reflections, federations were flexible in their responses, so they could tailor responses to regional needs and specificities. We saw that is particularly the case in, for example, in Germany, where there are some areas with higher infection and lower, so there were different and adapted responses according to the situation. In many countries, clearly, the machinery of government was very much in the forefront. Legislators didn't play a role. We saw some learning between constituent units in terms of the response. We can maybe elaborate to the discussion. We also saw some innovation, particularly in the area of intergovernmental relations. I refer to Australia. Also, Switzerland saw some ad hoc mechanism to address in terms of intergovernmental relation, in terms of addressing the crisis. In all federal countries, we observed a very vocal public debate about the pros and cons of federalism. Federalism definitely is not the only factor that explains successes or failures. Political will, leadership is important. The quality of the health system, political culture, the structure of society, also pure luck. When did the pandemic hit? Some countries had more time to prepare. Longer term, we assume that there's going to be a high impact on federal countries. The economic fallout is yet to be determined. Fiscal imbalance may lead to further centralization in many countries. In some countries that had a very centralized response, we might see a strengthening of constituent units. In some countries, asymmetric structures might be strengthened. However, that remains to be seen. All in all, I would say the purported benefits of federalism, they had largely played out in the first wave response to the crisis. As I mentioned, we saw some learning. We could tailor some responses to regional specificities. Democratic decision-making was not brought closer to the citizens because of the overwhelming engagement of the executive and the governments in the crisis. Lastly, looking at the purported disadvantages of federalism, yes, there were some patchwork approaches. However, we can debate whether this is actually a good thing or a bad thing. There was complex decision-making, but still that did not necessarily lead to slow decision-making. Whether reactions have been effective or ineffective, I think that is as far too early to tell. There needs to be more research on all aspects of federalism to come to a clear answer here, particularly looking at constitutional change, intergovernmental relations, the consequences for fiscal federalism, and so on. So I think there's a lot to be done going forward. And I think that our seminar today could be a very important opportunity to discuss some of those questions further down the road. Thank you very much for your attention.
Muchas gracias, Félix. No puedes escuchar los aplausos, pero sin duda, espera. Ok. Y esperamos, por supuesto, este estudio a principios de 2021. Siempre es complicado sacar un estudio sobre un procedimiento que está aún, o una situación que está aún en desarrollo. Por ello también, claro, lo entiendo que era necesario también hacer actualizaciones 2 o 3 veces a lo largo de este estudio. Y creo que no obstante, creo que esa perspectiva comparada ha sido una excelente introducción ahora a los estudios de caso. En primer lugar, vamos a centrarnos al caso de México. Desde España se mira con frecuencia a México, y también el federalismo mexicano es un objeto de estudio que siempre tenemos en nuestras actividades o proyectos de investigación. Por ello también agradezco mucho que Daniel Barceló está hoy con nosotros. Él es profesor investigador del Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas de la UNAM y también un amigo y un experto para la Fundación, creo que desde sus comienzos. Daniel, ¿puedes escucharme? Teníamos ahora algunos problemas con él, pero ¿estás con nosotros?
Perfectamente.
Pues un saludo a México.
Muchas gracias.
Y tienes la palabra.
Bien, buenos días desde México. En primer lugar, deseo agradecer desde luego a la Fundación Manuel Giménez la oportunidad de estar hoy en este observatorio con ustedes, al Observatorio del Instituto de Derecho Público y a la Fundación Friedrich Ebert. Bien, en particular, desde luego, a mis amigos José, Tudela y Mario Collin. Inicio adelantando las conclusiones sobre la situación de México. Ciertamente hay fallos en el arreglo constitucional del federalismo mexicano, pero ha de considerarse fallos aún mayores en el diseño del sistema presidencial, especialmente en lo concerniente con los poderes del Congreso y del Senado de la República. Pasemos a las 3 preguntas que Mario Collin nos pide contestar. Número 1. ¿Qué niveles de gobierno y qué instituciones se encargan de la gestión de las emergencias y la prestación de asistencia sanitaria? El sistema de distribución de competencias del federalismo mexicano del siglo XIX se inspiró en el modelo estadounidense de lista expresa de competencias de los poderes federales, por una parte, y por otra de competencias reservadas a los estados mediante la llamada cláusula residual. Pero el federalismo dual del siglo XIX ha dado paso a un sistema de distribución de competencias que en su gran mayoría son hoy concurrentes. La concurrencia se produce tanto en la función legislativa como en la ejecutiva. La materia de salud es concurrente. ¿Qué pertenece a cada orden de gobierno? La concurrencia tanto legislativa como ejecutiva se distribuye entre la Federación y los estados mediante una ley general de salud que aprueba el Congreso Federal. Subrayo, aprueba el Congreso Federal, y cuya ejecución esta última distribuye entre la administración pública federal y la administración pública de cada estado. Es decir, es una ley y no la Constitución directamente la que hace la delimitación de competencias. La Ley General de Salud condiciona las competencias legislativas y ejecutivas de los estados y le atribuye al gobierno federal la coordinación de la gestión sanitaria multinivel en todo momento. Pero esta competencia de coordinación se vuelve todavía más intensa durante una epidemia. Así lo dice expresamente la Constitución y la Ley General de Salud. La Constitución mexicana prevé la declaratoria de emergencia sanitaria como facultad exclusiva del gobierno federal sin intermediación del Congreso. Una vez declarada, el presidente puede restringir derechos fundamentales y libertades públicas por decreto. Y además cabe destacar que el Congreso no cuenta con un poder constitucional de control del gobierno durante una pandemia. Es decir, el Senado no puede llevar a cabo un control territorializado sobre cómo se gestiona la pandemia en cada estado. Y aún hay que añadir que en México el Senado no participa en la aprobación anual del presupuesto o en sus reformas, ya que es competencia exclusiva de la Cámara de Diputados. Esto último abre la puerta a la discrecionalidad del presidente en el otorgamiento de apoyos económicos a los estados gobernados por su mismo partido político para reducir el impacto sanitario y económico de la pandemia. Ahora bien, existe un control dentro del propio Poder Ejecutivo Federal dispuesto por la Constitución para la gestión de las emergencias sanitarias. La Constitución, desde 1917, creó el Consejo de Salubridad General precisamente para el control de epidemias. El Consejo es un cuerpo colegiado integrado por científicos de la medicina que tiene la obligación de emitir recomendaciones al presidente de la República y al secretario de Salud sobre las acciones que se deben tomar para la contención de una epidemia. Pero, ¿cómo ha operado este Consejo establecido en la Constitución durante la pandemia COVID-19? No ha operado. Es percepción generalizada entre las oposiciones en el Congreso, en los medios de comunicación y la academia que el presidente lo ha ignorado y en su lugar ha confiado la vocería y aún las decisiones de política sanitaria en un solo individuo, el subsecretario de Atención y Prevención de la Salud del Gobierno Federal. Existen mecanismos de coordinación intergubernamental en la Constitución y en la ley mexicana. La coordinación no ha sido el problema en el federalismo mexicano, sino la toma de las decisiones centrales sin participación de los estados. Hay en México un executive federalism construido en la Constitución y en las leyes, pero no hay un parliamentary federalism. No se ha adecuado el Parlamento, digamos el Senado y los congresos de los estados para esta nueva realidad. Bien, entonces la segunda pregunta que nos hace Mario: ¿cómo han gestionado las medidas estas unidades en respuesta a la emergencia del COVID-19? La política del presidente de la República desde el inicio de la pandemia hasta el día de hoy se ha mantenido inalterada, tanto en el aspecto sanitario como en el económico. Todo ello sin consensuarlo con las demás fuerzas políticas representadas en el Congreso Federal ni con los gobernadores de los estados. El presidente puso en la balanza la salud de los mexicanos por un lado y la protección de la economía por el otro, y ha decidido privilegiar la economía. Pero la economía, dice el presidente, de los grupos sociales más pobres. En su visión personal, el apoyo económico a los más pobres entra en conflicto con la protección de la economía de empresas pequeñas, medianas y grandes que constituyen el sustento de la clase media y alta. Y para proteger la economía de los más pobres, ha evitado tomar medidas que implican la restricción obligatoria por decreto presidencial de derechos fundamentales y libertades públicas. Ello con la única excepción de las clases presenciales en escuelas públicas y privadas que han sido suspendidas desde el 20 de marzo de 2020 y de algunas actividades no esenciales. El gobierno federal prefiere emitir exhortos a la población, no decretos obligatorios. Estableció un semáforo epidemiológico en función al riesgo sanitario para la población que opera por estados. La idea original del presidente era que el gobierno federal administrara el semáforo, pero tal esquema fue duramente rechazado por los estados. Se llegó a un acuerdo. El semáforo se gestiona con información de la Secretaría de Salud Federal y de las Secretarías de Salud estatales, pero es cada gobernador, con fundamento en su police power, en su poder de policía, el que decide el color en su estado. Y es el gobernador el que por decreto dispone las medidas restrictivas a los derechos humanos necesarias para salvaguardar la salud sin producir el colapso de sus economías. En materia económica, el presidente no ha variado en nada su plan de gobierno con el que accedió al poder en julio de 2018. Ello a pesar de los obligados recortes al presupuesto para el próximo año debido a la caída de la actividad económica y, por tanto, recaudación de impuestos. En el aspecto sanitario, su política consiste en una campaña de información preventiva, por un lado, y por el otro, equipar hospitales públicos y privados para evitar el colapso de los servicios de salud por exceso de pacientes en un periodo reducido de tiempo, como sucedió en España e Italia en marzo. Se ha negado a testar masivamente a la población con pruebas PCR y el presidente no usa mascarillas sanitarias hasta el día de hoy, lo cual dice de cuál es su postura al respecto. ¿Qué han hecho los estados? Un comentario de contexto. En marzo, el pronóstico del gobierno federal era que en México tendríamos 6,000 muertos y que la pandemia sería controlada hacia mediados del mes de mayo del 2020. La realidad ha sido otra. Al día de hoy, la cifra oficial de muertos supera las 100,000 personas. La cifra de centros independientes la estima en 230,000 defunciones aproximadamente. Y en cuanto a la economía, se ha registrado una caída del 10% del Producto Interno Bruto. Los gobiernos de los estados, al ver que el pronóstico de letalidad del COVID-19 del gobierno federal era equivocado, se desviaron de la política federal tanto en el aspecto sanitario como en el económico. En menor grado y sin estridencias, los gobiernos estatales gobernados por el partido del presidente, y mediante una confrontación aguda y pública con el presidente, los gobiernos de 10 estados, esto es, los gobiernos de 1/3 de los estados de la República. En los estados sí se han establecido por decreto restricciones a los derechos fundamentales para proteger la salud y sí se han apoyado económicamente a las empresas, además de las familias e individuos, por decretos de los respectivos gobernadores. Los gobiernos de 10 estados de la República formaron lo que llaman la Alianza Federalista, desde la cual en grupo confrontan al presidente a través de los medios de comunicación y de redes sociales. Por un lado, cuestionan la inteligencia de la política sanitaria y económica presidencial y por otro, el trato inequitativo que el presidente les otorga a los estados en cuanto a la distribución de recursos económicos por identidades de partido político. La Alianza Federalista exige una reconstrucción del federalismo, pero detrás de tal exigencia solo alcanzan a identificar el arreglo fiscal como una de las cuestiones a reformar. Tercera pregunta, ¿cuáles son las lecciones para el futuro? ¿Qué reformas se están abordando? 1. La Alianza Federalista solo propone una reforma profunda al arreglo federal para que los estados cuenten con recursos económicos suficientes para proveer el derecho a la salud en tiempos de normalidad y de pandemias. La idea es secundada por especialistas. A ello agregaría yo que es necesario ajustar igualmente los controles internos, parlamentarios y jurisdiccionales sobre los gobernadores establecidos en las constituciones de los estados, pues en los estados se reproduce el hiperpresidencialismo federal que ha facilitado corrupción, dispendio y negligencias impunes. Número 2. Es necesario someter a control parlamentario al presidente de México para declarar una emergencia sanitaria en todo el territorio nacional o en partes de él, en términos del artículo 27 de la Convención Americana de Derechos Humanos, y también construir un control parlamentario sobre el gobierno federal en tiempo real por la gestión sanitaria de la pandemia, pero sin posibilidad de censura vinculante. 3. Es necesario reconstruir el Senado de la República como Cámara de Representación de los gobiernos de los estados, para lo cual se requiere, en mi opinión, otorgarle 2 potestades expresamente en la Constitución, configurar procedimientos parlamentarios multinivel Senado, Congresos de los Estados y reformar la forma de integración del Senado mexicano. Telegráficamente, ya no existe el telégrafo o en tweet, digámoslo, son las siguientes. 1. El Senado debe participar en la aprobación del presupuesto federal en tiempos de normalidad y en la reforma a los mismos para enfrentar pandemias, de tal manera que se fomente la equidad interterritorial y se deje a un lado las decisiones por partido político. 2. El Senado debe contar con el poder de supervisar a los secretarios del presidente en tiempo real cuando se manifiesta una pandemia, sin potestad de censura vinculante. Debe haber un control indirecto desde los estados a través del Senado. porque en este momento en México hay un mecanismo, yo desde luego lo juzgo inconstitucional, en donde sí el presidente puede controlar a los gobernadores de los estados en la gestión de competencias concurrentes, lo hace a través de mecanismos fiscales que gestiona el ministro de Hacienda y Crédito Público, es decir, la ley de la zanahoria y el garrote, pero esto es sumamente arbitrario. 3. El Senado debe configurar procedimientos parlamentarios multinivel para comunicarse con los congresos de los estados, de tal manera que los funcionarios de los estados tengan voz, no voto, en la toma de decisiones federales y en el control parlamentario del gobierno federal. 4, es necesario reformar la integración del Senado mexicano. Debe haber un senador elegido y removido por mayoría absoluta del Congreso del Estado a propuesta del gobernador. Ello para que el Senado no actúe exclusivamente, como lo hace ahora, en la lógica dictada por los dirigentes de los partidos nacionales. Esta es una propuesta que hemos venido comentando y reflexionando ya desde hace más de una década, que está inspirada en lo que fue la forma de integrar el Senado en el federalismo mexicano del siglo XIX y que ahora, con cambios desde luego, pero es el principio subyacente en el Senado de la India, de Alemania y de Austria. Yo dejaría aquí mi intervención. Les agradezco su atención. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Daniel, y gracias por dirigir, digamos, tu intervención a través de las preguntas que te lanzaron. Hemos visto que sí, que hay muchas similitudes, al fin y al cabo, entre los debates sobre el sistema federal, entre España, también Alemania y México, como has comentado también, pero también grandes diferencias, la responsabilidad, al fin y al cabo, y la autonomía de los estados muy emblemático, y al fin y al cabo ese debate que has mencionado que llevamos también en el caso del mexicano sobre la Cámara Territorial o cómo se debe construir la Cámara Territorial. Vamos ahora a los Estados Unidos. Esa es una gran ventaja de estas conferencias Zoom. Vamos directamente a los Estados Unidos y es para mí un gran placer de poder contar hoy para nuestro observatorio con el profesor John Kincaid. Como saben, John Kincaid es profesor de Gobierno y Servicio Público en el Lafayette College Eastern Pennsylvania y es presidente del Centro para el Estudio del Federalismo. El profesor Kincaid es uno de los más grandes conocedores del federalismo americano, pero también un experto muy relevante en el federalismo comparado. Él ha estado también en Zaragoza ya hace algunos años y yo me acuerdo aún que estuvimos discutiendo con él sobre el sistema sanitario de España. Pero hoy creo que no hay otro que puede explicarnos de una forma muy clara cómo ha reaccionado el federalismo americano ante la pandemia COVID o cómo la pandemia COVID ha cambiado, afectado el federalismo americano. John, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for your introduction, Mario. I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me. It's a privilege for me to be a part of this discussion. The COVID-19 has posed a major challenge to American federalism. The system has responded comparatively poorly if measured by cases and deaths, not because of structural flaws, but because of partisan polarization and a president not amenable to cooperative federalism and a coherent pandemic response. Among federal and quasi-federal countries, only Belgium, Spain, Mexico, and Argentina have performed worse than the United States as measured by COVID-19 deaths per capita. So the principal problem has been partisanship. The parties are not functioning to integrate the federal system as they often did in the past. Instead, they have been fragmenting the federal system. The system did demonstrate resilience, however, because the state's constitutionally protected police power enabled them to compensate in a dual federalist manner. The states also functioned as laboratories of democracy, reflecting diverse policy preferences and pandemic experiments. Although dual federalism was a second best solution in principle, it was the best politically available solution. Now, many critics argue that a key failure was the lack of a single federally managed, presidentially led national response. However, given the emergency uncertainty that accompanied the novel coronavirus, the best course of national action was not readily evident at first. Nevertheless, it's sometimes forgotten that initially the federal government did respond vigorously. President Trump restricted travel from China on January 31st. On March 13th, Trump issued 57 simultaneous disaster declarations for all of the states, Washington, D.C., and U.S. territories. It was the first all-state declaration in U.S. history. In addition, in March, Congress, by very large bipartisan measures, passed 4 major laws providing relief to individuals, businesses, and state and local governments in response to the pandemic. The Federal Reserve Board also shored up the state and local bond market and provided other assistance as well. So in direct aid to state and local governments, the federal government provided about $150 billion in March. Taken together, adding all of the legislation, the federal government provided about $360 billion in aid to state and local governments. After this burst of bipartisan activity from mid-March to early June, however, things fell apart as partisan fissures opened between the parties in Congress, between Congress and the White House, between the White House and governors, and among groups of governors as well. So one consequence is that Congress has not passed a second aid bill. Now, whether this is desirable or undesirable depends on your point of view, but the major stumbling blocks are different philosophies of fiscal responsibility and the age-old federalism conflict over how to distribute federal aid among the states in a way that does not unfairly benefit certain states at the expense of other states. Now, meanwhile, the federal government lacks constitutional authority to command a national response. When President Trump claimed total power to reopen states' economies on April 13th, he retreated the next day under very heavy criticism. President-elect Joe Biden, citing a constitutional issue, similarly retreated from his call for a national mask-wearing mandate. Now Biden is apparently limiting his mask mandate to federal property. Further, the Trump administration's pandemic performance lends little confidence that a presidentially led federal response would have been desirable. Moreover, if Trump has authoritarian inclinations, a national response might have exacerbated those proclivities. There's little evidence of this, although a few of President Trump's actions have raised some concerns, but for the most part, not. What I'd like to do is to look at the U.S. response in terms of some of the currently prominent models of federalism that are talked about in the United States. So one of these models you might call nationalist cooperative federalism. This school defines cooperative federalism as the willingness of states to comply with national directives. The model treats states as though they were prisoners of war, facing a jailer who says, if you cooperate, you will get extra rations. If you don't cooperate, we will hammer you. So the advocates of this model contend that the states actually enjoy being prefects of the federal government because they do have some wiggle room in implementing federal policies. So this model situates uniformity and finality for first order norms at the national level, while allowing dialogue and plurality at the level of state implementation of those norms. But it seems to me this model is ill-suited to the pandemic because it ignores James Madison's warning that enlightened statesmen will not always be at the helm, and thus whether first order norms emanating from the Trump administration would have been desirable norms. The pandemic also puts the school in the odd position of having to say that the governors who implemented the strictest and longest lockdowns were uncooperative. a position wholly endorsed by President Trump, who called these so-called uncooperative governors mutineers and tweeted messages such as "Liberate Michigan," because he wanted the states to lift their lockdowns much earlier than most of the governors wished to do that. Now, part of the problem may be that in situating first order norms at the national level, this model does not specify just what the legitimate source of first order norms should be. Must these norms emanate only from an act of Congress signed into law by a president, or can they emanate from the Supreme Court, presidential executive orders, and agency regulations? The notion that anything coming out of Washington, D.C. must be viewed as a first order norm requiring state compliance leaves no room for what we have traditionally understood to be federalism as a system of non-centralized power rather than a decentralized unitary system. So this model seems poorly suited to fit the pandemic crisis that we have experienced. And even though there has been centralization that has reduced state autonomy, COVID-19, however, showed that state sovereignty is far from dead. This goes to Felix's point about reassertions of constituent unit powers. Now, a national response can also rest on reciprocal state-local coordination, which is the essence of cooperative federalism. This occurred in a few federal countries, but such cooperative federalism in the United States foundered first on partisan polarization, second on President Trump's personal presidency, and also third, the coronavirus's arrival during a presidential election year, an impeachment trial of a president running for re-election, and very low public trust in the federal government and in fellow citizens. So even though Trump held more than 90 conference calls with state, local, and tribal leaders between January and the end of March, he never forged a reciprocally cooperative relationship. He sought to shift blame for failures onto governors. His public statements featured bilateral rather than multilateral relations with governors, especially feuds with some Democratic governors, which included name-calling and threats of federal funding cuts. He also battled with some Republican governors, such as Maryland's Governor Larry Hogan, who was chair of the National Governors Association. So consequently, many governors turned to Vice President Mike Pence for assistance rather than to President Trump in the White House. So the president's intergovernmental behavior, in my view, cohered with his imagining the presidency as a platform for his personal expression. He did not conceptualize cooperative federalism as a partnership of shared powers aimed at achieving common objectives. Instead, the transgressive character of his presidency breached customary intergovernmental norms, although many agencies, such as the Centers for Disease Control and the Army Corps of Engineers, largely maintained those norms of cooperation with state and local governments. Governors, to some extent, also played a role in failing to formulate a cooperative nationwide response because of their own party divisions. Partisanship is such a fundamental cleavage today that it affects how people view COVID-19 and make healthcare choices. A prominent feature of the US response has been sharp partisan divisions among both political leaders and citizens in their perceptions of the pandemic's severity and beliefs about the appropriate policies and personal behaviors. Most Democratic governors and mayors imposed earlier, longer, and more draconian stay-at-home orders than did Republican governors. Democrats prioritized virus suppression. Republicans generally saw the economy as an equally or more important dimension of public policy. So they sought to balance economic sustainability while trying to minimize collateral damages of lockdowns. So this partnership has generated conflicts not only between the president and Democratic governors, but also between the governors of one party and county excuse me, and municipal executives of the other party. Over time, among citizens too, Democrats reduced social activities and practiced social distancing more than independents, while Republicans engaged in more social activities and less social distancing than either group. So a president more amenable to intergovernmental cooperation might have tempered partisan conflict and provided political cover for Republican governors, but would still have had difficulty, I think, implementing a genuinely cooperative federalism because of the cross-party conflict in the United States. Consequently, the dualism of American federalism, which is a barrier to unilateral federal action, enabled the states to respond to COVID-19. Although dual federalism has long been declared dead, path dependency as well as the system's constitutional structure have ensured the endurance of important elements of dual federalism, the notion that the federal and state governments occupy separate spheres of power. And this was recently reaffirmed by the Supreme Court in a recent decision, for example. So the vast lockdowns instituted by so many governors have no precedent in US history. The unprecedented exercises of power over citizens and the national economy mandated by most governors and by many mayors and county executives have been extraordinary manifestations of dual federalism, demonstrating that the police power, which was not delegated to the federal government in the Constitution, remains a potent power of the states. The 10th Amendment, on which this largely rests, appears to be alive and well in this respect, and to date, the US Supreme Court has not curtailed these state powers. We only have one federal court decision from a district court judge in Pennsylvania who ruled that the Pennsylvania governor's lockdown violated various rights provisions of the US Constitution. This ruling is on appeal and no final decision has been made yet. So under radical uncertainty, such as the novel coronavirus, it may be desirable for the states to be laboratories of democracy, at least until sufficient knowledge is available to formulate and negotiate a sensible nationwide policy. The outlines of a possible consensus did not emerge until several months into the pandemic, when many policymakers concluded that widespread testing, mask wearing, social distancing, and contact tracing are pre-vaccine keys to mitigation. Now, the laboratories of democracy concept presupposes that some experiments will be adopted by other states or the federal government. State and local officials nationwide have shared many policy ideas and used their national associations to disseminate information. However, innovation diffusion has been hampered by partisan barriers, as has been in other fields. So not all states adopted a lockdown. Those adopting them exhibited considerable variation in length, severity, and reopening metrics. In turn, neither the White House nor Congress seems to have tried to use the results of state experiments to foster cooperative collaboration. So a potential liability of a laboratories of democracy response is that infections can cross state lines. However, this was mitigated after many lockdowns by a 95% drop in domestic air travel by April 2nd, steep declines in ground interstate public transportation, self-quarantines of out-of-state arrivals that were ordered by many states, and many individuals curtailing their own mobility. So the states' responses have not been ideal or as efficacious as it might have been a cooperative federalism response, but absent the state's constitutional authority to act, the pandemic would have been worse. In this respect, dual federalism came to the rescue. The constitutional design allowed states to respond according to their diverse preferences and also largely confined the consequences of each state's choice to that state. System failures were not due mainly to structural flaws, but to partisan polarization, which itself is largely the result of centralization that has occurred since the late 1960s and the nationalization of so many issues once decided by the states. Absent the polarization, generated by nationalization's weakening of federalism, the system might have responded to the crisis in a more effective spirit of cooperative federalism. A more centralized response may arrive next year. President-elect Biden says he will institute a more centralized response to COVID-19. Also, the federal court case coming out of Pennsylvania could ultimately curtail states' powers on individual rights grounds. The district judge opined that since the Supreme Court first gave states broad powers in pandemics, times have changed. We are more sensitive to rights than we were in the past, and therefore governors may have overstepped their constitutional bounds. So both President Biden and the possible ultimate response of the federal court could substantially reshape the way the states will be able to respond to future healthcare crises. So at the moment, of course, the United States is experiencing a third wave of COVID-19, and this third wave is much worse than the previous two waves. Almost every state is affected, and governors have been very reluctant to reinstitute lockdowns because of the economic situation. So we are in the middle of an ongoing crisis, which really makes it impossible to make predictions or reach conclusions at this point in time about how well or poorly the federal system has responded to COVID-19 in the United States. So I'll end there, and thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, John. Ha sido una presentación estupenda y al fin y al cabo lo has conseguido explicarnos de forma muy claro. Por un lado, el conflicto partidista que determina el federalismo americano, pero por otro lado también la fuerte existencia aún del federalismo dual y donde cada estado tiene también sus características propias. Lo hemos visto hace poco también en las elecciones donde al final cada estado tenía un sistema electoral también diferente. Quiero recordar al público que puede lanzar ya preguntas y después en un coloquio voy a dirigir esas preguntas a los ponentes. Pero antes del coloquio vamos ahora a Alemania. El federalismo alemán siempre es también una referencia en el debate sobre reformas del modelo territorial de España y tengo el gusto de contar hoy con la profesora Johanna Schnabel. La profesora Schnabel aún no ha estado en Zaragoza, pero espero pronto poder contar con ella también de forma presencial en uno de nuestros eventos. Ella es una experta de federalismo alemán, pero más bien es también una experta en una de las características muy importantes del federalismo alemán, que son las relaciones intergubernamentales. Y le he pedido también que centre, por favor, su intervención justamente en este tema. Creo que es un tema es esencial para entender la contestación o la reacción del federalismo alemán ante la pandemia. Profesora Schnabel, Johanna, ¿estás con nosotros?
Yes, I am.
Oh, fine. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm trying to share my screen, hoping that it works. Well, thank you very much, Mario, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. It was very interesting to hear more about the Mexican case, which I know very little about, and the American case, which I know a bit more about, but still. I think the story that I'm going to tell is slightly more boring than those two stories. However, it's more of a success story, and I guess we're in times of a pandemic, this is what we may be interested in, right? So Germany has warded the crisis quite well. I mean, it is still a crisis. It has done well so far. German hospitals have never been overwhelmed. Germany has been able to avoid a strict lockdown like the one that you have been experiencing. And German federalism has done quite well. Now, if we're thinking about German federalism, three characteristics come to mind. The first one is centralization, the second one, administrative federalism, and intergovernmental coordination. In Germany, so Germany has a very high degree of centralization, which leaves the Länder with education, culture, the police, and local authorities as the only exclusive jurisdiction. All other powers are either shared or located at the federal level. However, this centralization has mainly concerned the legislative sphere. Germany has a functional distribution, a division of power, where the Länder implement most federal legislation. So the federal government has a very small civil service and relies on the Länder to implement its decisions. As a consequence, the federal government and the Länder amongst themselves coordinate very closely and very frequently, using formal institutions and informal arrangements. Via the Bundesrat, the Länder participate in federal decision-making. Bundesrat consists of members of Länder governments. In addition to the Bundesrat, a number of intergovernmental councils, which are called ministerial conferences, exist in Germany, cover a broad range of policy areas. The federal government is a member of some of these councils, but not of all of them. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic confirmed administrative federalism and intergovernmental coordination. However, decision-making has been surprisingly decentralized, which is very unusual for German federalism and quite different from other countries such as Spain or also Switzerland, which is known for being decentralized, however. So the crisis has highlighted the role of the Länder as decision makers and as public service providers. And what is more, the Länder have not only accepted this responsibility, they have actually been quite assertive vis-a-vis the federal government. One reason why the approach to the management of the pandemic was decentralized is that the division of responsibilities for health and emergency management is very much geared towards the Länder. So health policy is a shared jurisdiction, one of the many shared jurisdictions. But hospital planning, which was very important during the crisis, or has been, is a responsibility of the Länder. Now, more importantly, the Infectious Disease Act, which is Germany's pandemic law, authorizes the Länder to impose a range of containment measures. So it's a Länder who decide on which measures to introduce, when to introduce them, and what their strictness should be. And public health offices execute and to some extent enforce these decisions, these measures. These offices operate under land jurisdiction, the local authorities. And so the Infectious Disease Act provides the Länder with quite some discretion that actually goes beyond that typical of the administrative federalism that we know in Germany. The Infectious Disease Act assigns the federal government the role of the coordinator. Federal government cannot decide on individual measures, it can coordinate them with the Länder. It is, though, in charge of, or it is authorized to procure medical equipment, and it has still the responsibility over international borders and international travel. So, in short, the most responsibilities lie with the Länder, but the Infectious Disease Act also induces very strong coordination. In line with this decentralized approach as mandated by the Infectious Disease Act, the Länder did decide on most measures. So Länder passed regulations to ban events and gatherings, close restaurants, shops, schools, and other premises, required face masks, and imposed quarantine on travelers. I included some examples of Länder regulations here, which is from the the land I am from, Baden-Württemberg, which has its own corona ordinance and has amended that several times. So once the peak of infections was reached, the Länder again decided to lift measures by amending their regulations. The only areas where the federal government exercised decision-making power concern international borders, the procurement of medical equipment, and economic stimulus measures. Although economic stimulus measures were then implemented by the Länder, some of them at least, given administrative federalism and the functional distribution of power. So most of these measures were coordinated between the federal government and the Länder themselves. And to coordinate, the governments relied on existing formats. Germany has a conference of premiers that includes all the Länder premiers that meets frequently throughout the year, and every once in a while meets with the chancellor. And this is what happens, is especially in the early phases of the pandemic, these meetings took place weekly and were followed by joint press conferences. So one of them, that's from a very recent one, shows Merkel, the Bavarian premier, and the Berlin's premier, who is currently the chair of the Conference of Premiers. So these press conferences, the chancellor and the premiers together announced joint resolutions and agreements. And the reopening of restaurants and bars was also coordinated by the Conference of Ministers of the Economy, and the Conference of Ministers of Education coordinated classroom teaching and semester times at universities, for instance. The Bundesrat, the institution for which Germany is famous, played a very minor role. One reason is that most decision-making took place in the Länder anyway. The other reason is that, and that has been mentioned before, parliaments were more or less sidelined during the pandemic. So the only instance where the Bundesrat actually mattered was in regard to several reforms of the Infectious Disease Act and the consent it had to give to some of the stimulus measures. So while the absence or the small role played by parliaments is a problem when it comes to parliamentary scrutiny, the minor role played by the Bundesrat was not an issue for federal relations because coordination happened anyways through informal mechanisms. And I've said that most measures have been coordinated. This is not exactly true, or it is true, but it doesn't mean that all decisions have been coordinated. There were a few unilateral decisions regarding school closures, the reopening of international borders, and the reopening of domestic borders. These unilateral decisions did not trigger any tensions. It does not mean that there were no tensions at all either. During the first wave, when it came to lifting restrictions, several Länder wanted to lift them as quickly as possible, while the federal government, and especially Chancellor Merkel, preferred a much more prudent approach. Now, during the second wave, more recently, actually last week, premiers and the chancellor met again. The federal government wanted to tighten restrictions and had drafted a proposal on that, which the Länder, many of them, very much opposed. Now, these tensions led to the federal government having to concede, and it was decided during the first wave that the Länder would decide on the lifting of many measures, their timing, and so on. And now during the second wave, the decision that was taken last week was that a decision would actually be postponed. So now we're waiting to see on what will happen Wednesday when the next meeting will take place. But it was clear that the responsibility to come up with a proposal now was with the Länder, and that is what they have currently been doing. So we have seen a proposal being circulated right now. So none of these tensions led to actual conflicts, and I would say they're much more indicative of the assertive role of the Länder during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, to conclude, Germany has seen a very unusual degree of decentralized decision was combined with very close intergovernmental coordination. And this seems to be a quite promising recipe for the management of a public health crisis. It allows to reap the benefits of federalism, which are decision-making close to citizens and to the consideration of local circumstances, while at the same time avoiding adverse effects of decentralization, such as contradictions, inefficiency, conflict, and competition. So by combining decentralized decision-making and intergovernmental coordination, Germany was able to have a national approach while providing enough scope for local circumstances to be taken into account. So this patchwork approach that was decried by some media was never actually a big problem. Policy diversity was very small, and as many federalism scholars have pointed out, was rather beneficial during a crisis, as you can see on this map here, that varied regionally and even locally. Despite this, centralization is back on the table. Several Länder, including Bavaria, have called for more powers at the federal level, which would, they expected, provide stronger central leadership. Now, where I've said that the decentralized decision-making that Germany took was quite unusual, I would say these such calls for more central leadership are quite typical of German federalism. So it is, Germany has a certain tendency to rely on federal government leadership whenever things get more complicated. Whether that really happens remains to be seen. The next year will be quite interesting with federal elections coming up and elections in many regional, many länder. So there is definitely more to study, more to expect. For now, thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Joana. Bueno, muchas gracias por esta presentación muy compacta. Tenías mucho más tiempo, pero así también gracias. Tenemos también tiempo para las preguntas del público. Antes de entrar en el coloquio, solamente informarles que los resúmenes de las ponencias de los ponentes van a estar incluidos en el próximo número de los cuadernos Manuel Giménez Abad que vamos a publicar a principios del mes de diciembre, así que también pueden verlo, leerlo también de forma con más calma. Además, la grabación vamos a incluir también en nuestra biblioteca. También el Instituto de Derecho Público también va a incluir este vídeo, tal y como también la Fundación Friedrich-Ebert o el Foro de Federaciones también si está interesado. Tenemos una primera pregunta en relación al caso de Estados Unidos y en concreto al rol de los tribunales de los estados en relación a las limitaciones de los derechos fundamentales, y esos tribunales han jugado también un rol muy relevante a la hora de levantar esas restricciones o no, y si se puede recurrir, o en Estados Unidos se puede recurrir al nivel federal, al Tribunal Constitucional Federal, en el caso de que una de estas decisiones ha sido digamos, levantado por parte de un tribunal de un estado. A lo mejor, John, si quieres ya contestar directamente esta pregunta que se dirige hacia ti. ¿Ha sido claro la...? John, ha sido...
Yeah.
Okay.
Are you directing a question to me?
Sí.
All right, I did not get the question.
No, sorry, it's a question regarding the role of the tribunals of the states. If they have a limitation of fundamental rights by one decision taken by the state government, was there any case that a tribunal of a state changed in this sense decision making by governments of states?
Yes, there were two. We've had 3 state Supreme Court cases on governors' orders to shut down, and in 2 of the states, Michigan and Wisconsin, the state Supreme Courts ruled that the governor did not have authority under the state constitution to issue such a broad shutdown. And so the governor's actions were declared to be unconstitutional in Michigan and in Wisconsin. In Pennsylvania, the state Supreme Court upheld the governor's authority to issue the lockdown. So the Supreme Court did not limit the governor's powers in Pennsylvania. But it was a federal district court in Pennsylvania that ruled that the governor's shutdown order violated the Bill of Rights of the United States Constitution. And that is the decision that's now on appeal. So we do not have a final decision on that yet.
Muy bien. El rol de los tribunales ha sido también importante en Alemania. A lo mejor Johanna también podría hacer una referencia a ello. Y Daniel, si quieres, te dejo también un espacio para poder contestar esa pregunta desde la perspectiva de México. A lo mejor primero Johanna y luego Daniel.
Yes, of course. I think something somewhat similar happened in Germany. You might have heard about decisions in some of the Länder to not allow people to stay at hotels anymore and to contain the virus. And there have been several court cases, including in Berlin, where the decision was that these measures went well beyond what was needed. So they have somehow corrected land decision making.
Ok, Daniel.
Bueno, en el caso de México, realmente digamos que sí podría presentarse un asunto en sede de un tribunal constitucional estatal, pero no se ha presentado. Esto es más bien un defecto nuevamente que atribuyo al hiperpresidencialismo, que todavía no permite un desarrollo fuerte del control judicial en los estados. Por eso hablaba yo antes de que sí hay que reformar el arreglo federal, pero también hay que ver los controles internos dentro del federalismo, concretamente en los estados. De tal manera que, bueno, no se ha presentado el caso en México.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. ¿Hay otras preguntas por parte del público? Aquí hay una pregunta de Francisco Romero. I would like to ask Johanna if the crisis has had some kind of impact on the new equalization settlement that recently entered into force. Also, are the Länder demanding more funds to deal with the crisis, or would they prefer the federal level to get more powers to deal with future waves and assume the costs as well? Johanna.
Well, thank you very much. That's a great question. Of course, fiscal relations are always lead to conflicts, and obviously the crisis has very significant impacts on the economy, well, on the national level and in the Länder, and obviously also on their finances. So several things have happened. The German debt brake has been temporarily suspended. Germany was quite proud, especially the federal finance minister, to have achieved what is called the black zero, so a balanced budget. Obviously now that has been jeopardized by the crisis. So there's one, and the debt brake applies to both the federal government and the Länder. It has a provision, however, allowing for deviations during emergencies. The second thing that happened is that the federal government has adopted a broad range of fiscal stimulus or economic stimulus measures that also provide financial assistance to the Länder, and several programs being administered by the Länder. So the Länder have already received quite some support from the federal government. However, knowing German federalism and German fiscal federalism, more demands are to be expected. I think especially once the real consequences of the crisis will be seen, hopefully, or not hopefully, but next year, I presume, there will be more pressures, obviously, on both the federal government and the Länder. And as I mentioned earlier, the tendency in Germany is to call on the federal government, especially in economic fiscal policy, where the federal government has better access to finances. It can help the Länder. The Länder have very little leeway to adjust their revenues. So yes, that can be expected.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Johanna. Una pregunta de Eva Sainz. Buenas tardes, Eva. Voy a leerla también, así se puede traducir del español al inglés. La primera intervención ha destacado a Canadá dentro de los estados federales con más coordinación. Y sin embargo, he leído muchas críticas respecto a la falta de coordinación en Canadá. Por ejemplo, han sido diferentes los criterios de aplicación de los tests según las provincias o las medidas de confinamiento o apertura. ¿En qué aspectos de la gestión de la pandemia ha existido coordinación en Canadá? Como no hemos tratado específicamente el ejemplo de Canadá, creo que sería Félix, que tiene la perspectiva global, y también es un conocedor del federalismo de Canadá, si puede contestar a esta pregunta. Y por supuesto también John o Daniel, Johanna, si conocéis o sabéis o algo, si queréis contestar a esa pregunta, también estáis invitados. Félix, te veo.
Thank you very much, Mario, and thank you for directing the question to me. I also think it's a great question, but at the core of the question to me does actually not speak against good intergovernmental cooperation. What's been said before, also in the country presentation, if there are differences in certain aspects of addressing the pandemic, that, from my perspective, does not necessarily have to be a problem. Particularly not in a country like Canada, which is so geographically dispersed, where you have big cities with larger outbreaks, and then you have provinces that are in principle rurally inhabited with very low numbers of infections. So why should all the measures be the same everywhere? However, there was a strong intergovernmental cooperation, particularly with regard to economic question and to designing the response for economic relief regarding income support, for example. So I think here intergovernmental cooperation was very crucial. Thank you.
¿Alguien más sobre el caso de Canadá? Sí. Si no, tenemos una pregunta que se dirige también a Johanna y se refiere a ese debate que teníamos, que estaba llevándose a cabo en el Bundestag alemán la semana pasada sobre la reforma de la ley de protección de la infección, el Infektionsschutzgesetz. Y la pregunta es si se trata de atribuir a la Federación capacidad para limitar derechos fundamentales en supuestos de crisis sanitarias, que es un fortalecimiento del gobierno federal a través de esta reforma. Johanna?
Again, thank you for that question. Let me first briefly add something to the Canadian case. So another element that has been coordinated was the procurement of medical equipment, so ventilators and PPE. Canada has a national stockpile from which, for which more equipment was procured by the federal government. It also had some bulk purchases together with the provinces, and then equipment from the national stockpile was distributed to the provinces. Now, I'm saying that because Germany does not have a national stockpile, so that's a difference that's actually debated right now whether it should have one. The question is, would that lead to more centralization? That being said, the procurement of medical equipment was also coordinated in Germany, even without the existence of a national stockpile. Now, to answer the question that I was asked, so the Bundestag and the Bundesrat have not only debated the reform, they've also adopted the reform. But the answer to the question that I've been asked is no. The federal government still cannot impose containment measures. It's still the Länder who are in charge of those. What the reform does, however, is that it defines which measures the Länder can impose, and it does that because this would give, that's the expectation, that gives more a better legal basis, because for now the Länder could decide to limit fundamental rights without it being defined what kind of measures they can impose.
Sí, principalmente se trata al final de concretar este gran margen que dejaba esta ley abierto, que fue aprobado en marzo, y ahora se ha concretado, digamos, este poder de delegación al gobierno federal. Daniel Barceló tiene una pregunta también para Johanna. ¿Qué hubiera pasado si la canciller hubiera jugado o hubiera actuado de una forma más partidista en la gestión de la crisis y no tanto como un statemanship, como la forma en que ha actuado la señora Merkel, digamos?
Well, counterfactual questions are always a bit mean. It's very difficult to answer. So I can only draw on the experience in the past. There have been some issues where parties disagreed much more. I don't think they've ever really prevented coordination, at least not in the last, let's say, two decades. So I would expect that if there was more partisan conflict, coordination would still occur. A, because the coordination mechanisms exist. B, because German citizens or population expect governments to coordinate. They expect somewhat a uniform approach. That has always been the red thread shaping German policymaking and decision making. So, and I guess also Merkel's personal approach has always been to manage a crisis, to get the country well through a crisis. So I find it very difficult to see Merkel playing in a highly partisan mode, as you put it.
Okay. Otra pregunta, activamos. Muy bien. Esa no es una pregunta, sino un debate del chat. ¿Alguna pregunta a los 4 ponentes más? Solamente desde mi punto de vista una pregunta general a los 3 ponentes sobre los estudios de caso, y así que siempre es un debate si el federalismo ha sido un obstáculo o ha sido una gran ventaja en la gestión de la crisis. Entonces, la pregunta a los 3 sería, una pregunta con una respuesta a lo mejor corta, si el sistema federal, México, Estados Unidos o en Alemania fue, digamos, un obstáculo, o consideran esto el sistema federal como una oportunidad en la gestión de la crisis. A lo mejor podemos empezar con Daniel.
El sistema federal ha demostrado una valiosa forma de gestión de la pandemia, aun cuando hay un problema en la toma de decisiones políticas a nivel central, que todavía, desde luego, como decía el profesor Kincaid, y coincido con él, todavía es prematuro poder determinar con absoluta certeza qué decisiones fueron las correctas y cuáles no. Pero, sin embargo, ante la posible falta de el gobierno federal de actuación, cosa que no nos habíamos planteado antes, porque el que actuaba era el presidente coordinando a los gobernadores, y nunca se había dado el caso en el que el presidente no llevara, digamos, la voz cantante en la política pública sanitaria. Nunca se había dado tampoco el caso de una situación como la del COVID-19. Pero bueno, los estados creo que han hecho una buena labor en cuanto a servir de control del poder, ¿no? Para que se tomen medidas racionales basadas en la ciencia. Creo que eso ha contribuido a que tengamos resultados menos malos de los que tenemos. Y hay que esperar a ver qué pasa al final, porque al final me refiero de la pandemia, porque, bueno, estamos viendo que los cuatro países con mayor número de muertos son federales, claro, son también estados con poblaciones muy elevadas y todo. Y yo me pregunto, ¿no? En el caso de México, desde luego es un país con subdesarrollo político, con una democracia no consolidada, pero me pregunto también qué tanto tiene que ver el efecto del sistema presidencial, no solo del sistema federal, en la toma de decisiones.
Muchas gracias, Daniel. John.
Can you rephrase the question?
No, just the question was if federalism was an obstacle or an advantage to manage the crisis.
Was what an obstacle?
An obstacle for the management?
Well, well, in the United States, yeah, political partisanship was the major obstacle to intergovernmental cooperation. So there would have been much more cooperation if that were not the case. The country is seriously polarized along political party lines. And so, you know, there was initial cooperation at the start in March. The federal government does have a stockpile. It provided equipment to state and local governments and to nursing homes, long-term care facilities, and so on. But then it all fell apart by June, and the president, since the election, has not said a word about COVID-19. He's walked away from the crisis altogether. It's really quite astonishing that he's playing no role whatsoever, and he's not cooperating with the president-elect in the plans for distributing the vaccine. So the federal government made a major contribution in investing in a vaccine. So we have 2 vaccines now, which are 94 to 95% effective, but they have to be distributed to millions of people, and that has to occur through the states. And once the presidential transition occurs, it's really important that the Biden administration know what that process is. And so far, President Trump has been totally uncooperative. So it's not only partisanship, it's also the poor leadership of President Trump.
Muchas gracias. Entonces también se confirma en cierta forma, claro, el debate es un debate muy simplicista sobre el obstáculo, si el federalismo obstaculiza o favorece la gestión de la crisis, si no hay una multitud de otros factores que interfieren en ello. Joanna.
Yeah, I very much agree with you, and I guess it is yet very difficult to give a conclusive answer to that. I think we need to see how the pandemic evolves and probably engage in some kind of comparison of different federal countries. They have reacted, as we have seen, in quite different ways. I think it will make sense at some point to compare countries that have reacted in a similar way in a very different way, and then potentially compare them with unitary countries so that we can draw really robust conclusions on the advantages and disadvantages of federalism in general. Yes, the same applies to Germany. We'll have to see the final outcome. I guess it looks good so far. That's what we can say. And the combination, as I've said earlier, of decentralized decision-making with very close coordination in the crucial phases seemed to work quite well. So I think we can say that federalism has not been an obstacle in Germany. It has rather helped the crisis management in Germany. And as I mentioned, I think it's quite known in Germany, there's this very strong tendency to uniform approaches, to harmonization. So there has been some dissatisfaction, and it has been reported that some people were unhappy with what has been called the patchwork of measures in Germany. However, I would say it makes sense to have stricter measures in, let's say, Bavaria, North Rhine-Westphalia, where infection rates are much higher than in, for example, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. And the premier of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern has made that clear very, very often, that there should not be stricter measures in areas with very low infection rates, just because infection rates are very high in some areas of Bavaria. So I guess all in all, we can conclude that German federalism has helped the handling of the crisis, has been a good response to that situation.
Muy bien. Eso podrían ser ya buenas palabras para concluir, pero tengo una pregunta más y esa pregunta está relacionada con el entorno del trabajo de la Fundación Manuel Giménez Abad. La Fundación Manuel Giménez Abad es una fundación con sede en las Cortes de Aragón y por ello también siempre es una preocupación o un interés saber cómo reaccionaban los parlamentos subnacionales en esta crisis. Y a lo mejor Daniel ya ha mencionado también para el caso de México, por ello también me gustaría empezar con Joana. ¿Cómo reaccionaron o qué rol han jugado los Landtage, los parlamentos de los Länder en esta crisis?
Yes, so similar to the parliaments on the federal level, these parliaments have mainly been sidelined, especially in the very early phases of the pandemic. However, they have discussed different measures and they have discussed legislation recently, but there is a study going on that looks at the different debates in the Länder parliaments. The conclusions are yet to be out, but I guess it was a general problem was the prevalence of executive federalism and the sidelining of parliaments on both levels of government.
Muchas gracias, Joana. Y John, ¿podrías decirnos un poco algunas palabras sobre el rol de los parlamentos de los estados?
Well, I would say the Congress has not been sidelined. It's just that because of the partisan division within Congress, they haven't been able to agree on additional legislation since March. In the state legislatures, it depends on if the legislature is the same party as the governor, then there's a high degree of cooperation between the legislature and the governor. Where the legislature is of a different party than the governor, that's where the conflict occurs. And, in my state, for example, the legislature is Republican, the governor is a Democrat, and the governor has vetoed 8 bills passed by the Republican legislature trying to limit the governor's powers. And so he's used his veto power to prevent that from happening. So they've been sidelined to some extent, but they are still very active.
Muchas gracias. Daniel, tú lo mencionaste ya antes. ¿Quieres decir una palabra más?
Pues nada más decir que en el caso del federalismo mexicano, los congresos de los estados han prestado apoyo a las, digamos, a las iniciativas que han tenido los gobernadores de los estados en presentar diversos tipos de leyes o en modificar presupuestos. Y han habido 2 elecciones estatales, esto es interesante destacar, durante la pandemia hubieron 2 elecciones estatales y las 2 las ganó el partido en el gobierno del estado, es decir, que era diferente al partido del presidente de la República. De tal manera que, de alguna forma, algunos han interpretado que ello ha implicado un respaldo a la política estatal.
Pues muchas gracias. Gracias por su interés. Tenemos que cerrar ya aquí nuestro seminario, nuestro observatorio. El año que viene vamos a celebrar el observatorio simplemente de forma presencial. Creo que tocaría de nuevo Zaragoza. Entonces estarán invitados todos al Palacio de la Aljafería para debatir con nosotros de forma presencial estos temas No obstante, hasta el año que viene vamos a seguir, por supuesto, estos temas y les invito también a echar un vistazo a nuestra página web porque creo que ya tenemos cada semana una actividad muy interesante y, por supuesto, también que visiten las páginas web del Observatorio de Derecho Público, del Instituto de Derecho Público de Barcelona, del Foro de las Federaciones y, por supuesto, también de la Fundación Friedrich Ebert. Muchas gracias y hasta la próxima.
Gracias.